Okay, this is Parshat Naso, the second Parsha of the book of Bamidbar. And we always read this the week after Shavuos. So we want to look into why that is. So first of all, we have to know that the previous Parsha, Bamidbar, is, of course, then always read right before Shavuos. Many reasons are given. One reason is in the Parsha of Bamidbar, everyone is counted. Not only is everyone counted, but everyone counts. And this is a very, very important message before we receive the Torah at Sinai. According to tradition, every Jewish soul that would ever be born, would ever come into the world, and every future convert, all of our souls were at Sinai. This is our tradition, and according to the secrets of reincarnation, so it's not that we would be a soul in the future. We were there. It was our souls, different bodies, different generation, but it was our soul that was at Sinai. So that's always read right before Shavuos. And this week's Parsha, Naso, is always read afterwards. So we want to spend our time tonight discussing why is that? What is it about this Parsha that connects to the idea of being right after Shavuos? So to lead up to this, there is a midrash that until the giving of the Torah at Sinai, God could only, as it were, come down into the world so far, and a human being could only elevate themselves to God so far. At the giving of the Torah, this arrangement, let's say, this dynamic was canceled, because it says, and God came down on Mount Sinai. And it says, and Moshe went up to the mountain. So here we have, in a sense, heaven and earth meeting, kissing, but let's say the old arrangement that God could only descend into the world, not that he couldn't, of course he could, but the circumstances in the world and in human consciousness was that God could only descend so far, and a person could only elevate themselves so far. But that was canceled at the giving of the Torah. So in a sense, it sounds like, well, that's the ultimate status, the ultimate stage of historical development, is that God could come down into the world and man could rise up to God. Now, obviously, that is a very, very high level. But now we have to see that the end of this week's Parsha, every Parsha usually has a number of different stories, incidences, mitzvot that are given, and Naso is like all of them. The end of the Parsha, which is actually almost a third of the Parsha, and I'm just going to mention as an aside, this is the longest Parsha of the Torah, 176 verses. It's the longest Parsha. And a lot of that is because of the last, we'll call it a third of the Parsha, recounts the gifts that the princes of the 12 tribes brought on the day that the tabernacle was dedicated. So an obvious question is asked here, and this is a good part of what we're going to deal with, is this part of the princes bringing the gifts is totally out of chronological order. the dedication of the temple had happened already, historically, in chronological time. So the question is why is it attached to this parsha? Why is it at the end of this parsha? So we'll go back a minute to the instructions to build the Mishkan, because here the princes are bringing gifts on the day that the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is dedicated. But when we were commanded to build the tabernacle, so one of the most important verses in the entire Torah says, God is speaking to the Jewish people, and he said, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a dwelling place, a holy place, and I will dwell in their midst. We might have even covered this way back in the book of Shemot, of Exodus. Make for me a holy place, and I will dwell among them. So the very, very well-known and famous statement is, it doesn't say I will dwell in it, meaning in the Mishkan, but it says I will dwell in them, in the people. So this is a very, very important point, and this helps us understand why the bringing of the gifts of the princes comes at the end of this parsha after Mount Sinai. So before we answer this in a deeper way, I just want to take a little bit of an aside just to discuss shortly, what is this thing that there's something in the Torah that is not in chronological order? If one didn't know this, one would read through the Torah and assume that everything is happening in a chronological order. But this is not true. And this parsha is one of the proofs of it, because the dates are clearly that when they brought the gifts happened already a substantial time before. So this is definitely out of chronological order. But there are many, many other parts of the Torah that there's a term for it. Ein mukdam v'muchar b'Torah. There's no before and after in the Torah, meaning that it's not necessarily that everything that we're reading, the storyline is chronological. Now, we have to mention that there are a number of places, like our portion, where it's clear that it's not in chronological order. And then you have to look for the reason. Well, why is that? Why wouldn't the Torah put the gifts of the princes in the proper chronological order? Why is it put over here? That's what we're going to answer. But what's very, very interesting is that there's actually quite a bit of disagreement about certain incidences. If the way that the Torah is read, if it is in chronological order, or is it possible that this segment is not in chronological order? This is too much of a subject for us tonight. I'm just pointing out this overall concept. And I want to mention just a few things just so we can get an understanding here. First of all, we should know that Rashi, who is probably the most important commentary on the Chumash, though many people disagree with different things that Rashi says, he interpreted many, many different things in the Torah as not being in their chronological order. Whereas others, unless there's a pressing proof that it's not in chronological order, they would assume that it is. It's a very, very interesting subject. But I'll just mention one thing that goes along with this, is that it's a little bit like a movie. Now, there are certain movies that the storyline is totally chronological. But everyone knows that there are movies that use the technique called a flashback. It's telling a story, and then all of a sudden, in order to give more meaning, there's a flashback to one of the characters as a child, or some traumatic thing happened, and then they go back to the storyline. And a director might use this many, many times in the same movie, of going back and forth in time in order to make the story more compelling. So they answer that this is also true of the Torah. If the Torah is not in chronological order, so there is a compelling reason that we can learn from this. So I just want to mention one thing that goes along with this. It's not really this idea there's no before and after in the Torah, but the Torah has a unique phenomenon. It's not in modern Hebrew. It's only in the Torah where if you have a verb and the letter vav is put before the verb, if the verb is written in the past tense, you read it as if it's in the future tense. And if the verb is in the future tense and you put a vav before it, vav means and, you put a vav before it, it turns the future tense into a past tense. Now this is like a way out idea. So why would the Torah do this? One of the reasons is to teach us and alert us to the fact that the Torah is eternal. And it's not just talking about certain people a long time ago. By the switching of tenses, meaning time frames, all of a sudden the past can become the future and the future can become the past. So this gives us a feeling of an eternal message that is being given. So that's very similar to some of the reasoning of Ein Mukdam V'Muchar B'Torah. So now saying that, we're going to go back and try to understand why the gifts of the princes come at the end of this parsha, which is clearly a case of not in chronological order. So as we mentioned, the dynamic where God could only come down so far and man could only go so up, this was nullified at the giving of the Torah. So in one sense, it sounds like, well, this is the ultimate. God comes down and man goes up. But we're told that after receiving the Torah at Sinai, there's really more steps that had to be taken. And the two steps are, we needed to come into Israel, and we need to make a place for God totally in this world. Like God said, make for me a holy place, and I will dwell in their midst, meaning in the midst of each and every person. And that becomes the ultimate goal. In other words, we might think receiving the Torah in Sinai, this is it. This is the greatest thing. This is the accomplishment of everything that God wants in the world, is to give us the Torah. Now, obviously, it's a very important step. But if we didn't come into Israel, in a sense, we'd still be wandering in the desert. And the whole idea was to take the Torah and create a society based on the laws of the Torah. And of course, many of the laws of the Torah are predicated on our coming into Israel, especially all the agricultural laws. And so, in other words, so many of the laws are somewhat theoretic if we don't build a society that can sustain these laws. So that is the next step. So God gives us the Torah. God comes down to Mount Sinai. Moshe is able to go up to the mountain, but then we have to take the Torah into Israel. And the ultimate really is to make a dwelling place for God not just in the Mishkan, but in the whole world and in our souls, in our heart, in our minds. And this answers why the gifts of the princes on the day that the Mishkan is dedicated comes after the giving of the Torah at Sinai, in order to tell us that this is the ultimate goal, is to make a dwelling place for God in this world. So having said that, there are many, many different reasons given for why God created the world. And of course, this is a human attempt to understand exactly. There are many verses, like the verse that we just said, make for me a dwelling place and I will dwell in their midst. There are many verses that hint to the various reasons that we could conjecture that God created the world. So I'm going to present 4 here, and we'll call that in ascending order. It's not like totally hierarchical like this, but in a certain way, it mirrors the Sfirot. Again, we always have our friendly Sfirot chart here. So the first reason given, it's not the first in order, but relating to the lowest level of Malchut. Malchut, of course, means kingdom. So a reason is given, Ein Melech below Am. There's no king without a people. In other words, the function of a king only exists. There's no reality to it unless there's a kingdom. There's a people for the king to be king over. So of course, 100 times a day, we say 100 blessings a day. We say, blessed are you, O God, King of the universe. We, in a sense, crown, coronate, acknowledge God as King of the universe 100 times a day. So that's the idea that, again, we're talking in human terms now, that God needed or wanted to create a world in order that he could be king. Now, again, we're talking in human terms and human emotions here. But the idea is that there's an aspect of God that is malchut, that is kingdom, is noble, and that can only exist if there are a people. So now we go up the sfirot to this whole level. This is what's called the emotional aspect of a human being. And here we're told that God is the ultimate of chesed, of loving kindness. And that when someone has an innate desire or want to give, he could only give if there's a recipient. So the next reason given for God creating the world is because God is the essence of goodness, of loving kindness, of giving. And of course, in order to give, there has to be a recipient. So therefore, God creates a world in order that this aspect of God can be manifest. Then we go up to what's called the more intellectual. And remember, there's another sphere here called Dat. So Chachma, Bina, and Dat. This is Chabad. Chachma, Bina, and Dat relates to the next reason, which is that God had a desire to be known. That God sought as it were, a partner that could be related to as it were, on the intellectual level. Again, I have to say over and over again, we're talking in human terms here. And that's the best we can do to try to understand the the motivation of God, the essence of God. So this is written in the Zohar, that God wanted to be known. And then we come to the last reason, and this is very connected, again, to why the last part of Parsha Naso comes not in chronological order, is it says in the Midrash, V'hita ve'akadosh baruch hu liyot lo dira b'tachtonim, that God had a desire to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. And it's given over that this is the most enigmatic of all of the reasons, is how to understand a desire for God, who is infinite, who is beyond time and space, is beyond all description, beyond all comprehension, why God has a desire to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. But we're told through many, many different teachings, many different verses, that this is what God desires. And so much of Judaism is based on this idea that God put us in a physical, material world in order for us to become partners with God in this creation and to make our physical, material world like heaven on earth. As we've probably discussed many times in certain other religions or spiritual paths, it's considered to be spiritual, one has to separate from the physical and the material. Now, there is a certain truth to this, because as long as we are, almost call it addicted to physicality and materialism and our lower nature and the quest for money and power and our desires rule over us, then of course it is virtually impossible to rise to a level of spirituality. But nonetheless, the Jewish message is that ultimately physicality is not an impediment to spirituality, because that is our mission. Our mission is to take the physical material world and make it a proper vessel for holiness, for godliness, for spirituality. That is our goal. And we have a beautiful image in the dream of Yaakov, of Jacob, when he dreamt of a ladder that was firmly entrenched in the earth, and its head reached to the heavens. So the way it's interpreted is that, of course, the ladder connects heaven and earth, but one could interpret it, we start in the bottom, and the more you go up, the less you have to do with the physical. You don't want to be connected to the physical, but the Torah says that the ladder was firmly entrenched in the earth. What does this mean? Paradoxically, that in order to reach the heights of spirituality, we need to be connected firmly to the physical world. In a certain way, the more connected we are, now again, not in an addicted way, not in a way that we have no control over our desires, we have no control over our wanting more and more and more and more material goods. That's not what we're talking about. But that we see that the physical is a vessel for the spiritual. And so this goes back to what we were talking about, that the message of reading this parsha, especially the end about the gifts of the princes for the Mishkan, is telling us that after the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that there are other steps. And one is to come into Israel, but ultimately it's the teaching of the Mishkan. which is what, as God said, make for me a holy place and I will dwell in their midst. But that becomes the ultimate goal for really all of humanity, and it's certainly the mission of the Jewish people, is not to run away from this world, but is to try to make the best of it, to try to perfect it, to try to make it a fitting vessel for godliness, and ultimately that each and every person becomes a fitting vessel for God to dwell within our, not just our souls and our consciousness and our heart, but also, as it were, in our bodies, because God created us as physical beings with a spiritual soul, but God wants to come all the way down, not just to Mount Sinai. God wants to come all the ways down in this world. And we have a verse that says that God chose Zion. It was the place of his greatest desire. That God's desire is to dwell in Zion. And that's one of the explanations of what we call the Holy Land, is because there's a presence of God in the Holy Land that really cannot be found anyplace else. Now, obviously, God is everywhere at every moment in every space, but there is a concentration of godliness and God's presence in the Holy Land. That's what makes it holy. That's what makes it holy. So I think we've gotten the idea across. As always, there's much more that can be discussed. I will end with a blessing that each and every one of us does what they can to make a dwelling place for God in the world and in our very beings.